Hello and welcome to today's Dav Chat Show. I'm your host, Davina, and we're going to be talking about Trump's tax returns. If we don't make a noise about it ourselves, then there is silence or there is a muted mumbling, because you may have picked up that the mainstream media, in a collective sense, has a tendency to gloss over some of the most egregious conduct, malfeasance, corruption of people if they're Republican. So Democratic politicians are often held to account. It wouldn't be so bad if it didn't contrast so sharply with what Republicans experience, which is vetting after they've achieved public office, as was the case with George Santos, a Republican who won a New York district. He's now a member of the House of Congress, or he's a member of the House of Congress elect. He'll be put in position in January. The New York Times has, after the election, done an investigation into his resume, looked at the opposition research from the Democratic opposing candidates, and noticed that he has lied about having a charity. It's not registered. He's lied about his business income. He's lied about a whole bunch of things, and there's no record of him having gone to college at the college he says he went to. So why don't we hear more about it? I don't know, other than the clues are an increasing monopolies, increasing narrowing of the number of people who own media outlets that we engage with, which means an increasing consolidation of power. When you have less competition, and that competition and those billionaires are able to purchase themselves political power through the workings of the conservative justice-stacked Supreme Court, which ruled for a decision called Citizens United in 2010 that said the money of wealthy people is the same as their voice, and therefore they have the protections of the First Amendment to speak their mind with their money. And that continuing voice and influence voice of the billions of billionaires speaking via ads and via ownership and consolidation of media ownership means they're having a sizable impact on politics in terms of the taxes they pay, the opposition to regulation. You can see it with regards to gun ownership and the obstruction of gun safety laws that would improve our children's experiences at school, would reduce the need for scary gun drills, reduce the ease with which murder is facilitated in the United States, because accidental deaths are facilitated and suicides are facilitated and mass murder is facilitated by the relatively unchecked proliferation of guns in the United States. So let's go and look at Trump's taxes and see some notable figures that for 2020, released from the report from the Joint Committee, the House Ways and Means Committee. They released their report to the New York Times, and the New York Times published it. The final tax bill after credits in 2020 was $0. And in 2019, it was $133,000. In 2018, close to $1 million. In 2017, Trump's tax bill was $750, and the same in 2016, coincidentally. And in 2015, it was $641,931. So approximately $650,000. It's not a lot for someone who professes adamantly to be a billionaire, who was beyond capacity to be purchased by foreign influence. Definitely wouldn't be subject to influence from Vladimir Putin. Always a nonsensical argument, because who thinks there's any wealthy person that doesn't have a finely honed acquisitive instinct? Who thinks there's a wealthy person that said, oh yes, billions of dollars, that's enough for me. I'm drawing a line. I don't need any more wealth or power or influence, because that's not how wealth works. People who have finely honed abilities to set goals for themselves and sufficient avarice to pursue those billions of dollars, they don't stop. They don't stop. All right, let's look at the next bit of information. Income by source. Interest, 10 million. Wages. Who's paying him a wage? Dividends, $25,000. That's not a lot. Business income, negative 29,000. Real estate, negative nearly 16 million. Other businesses, $0 of income in 2020 and $0 of income in 2019. What? And $0 worth of capital gains in 2020, whereas 9.3 million in 2019. Other gains, negative 500,000 in 2020. And refunds, 382,000 in 2020. Refunds for what? That's curious. All right. Hi, Christopher. He says, I'm rocking that hat. Thank you. It's warm and I'm cold. There's going to be a lot of extreme weather forecast for this weekend, blizzard warnings, ice storm warnings for different areas of the United States. Oh, man. I really look to the words of John Lewis whenever I feel just kind of ground down by the fire hose of criminality and deceit from these folks. Because I should be happy. It's been literally years in the works, years of court challenges, Donald Trump taking the Democrats to court to avoid publicly releasing his tax returns, something that every candidate for president has done before running for public office or as part of running for public office for years. I think the only other candidate to not do it was another Republican presidential candidate, Richard Nixon. And I'll just check that. Did Richard Nixon release his tax returns? He released his taxes whilst under audit. And of course, the other big revelation of today and yesterday has been that Donald Trump kept saying, oh, I can't show my taxes because they're under audit. And for some reason, I've just made up, you can't show your taxes while they're under audit. Audits require you to never say anything about it. Nixon started the process. Okay. So Nixon released his tax returns whilst under audit, but Donald Trump said the ongoing audit of his taxes prevented him from releasing them to the public. But he said that whilst running for office in 2016. Now it turns out they were not under audit. In fact, even though it's mandatory for the president to undergo tax audits whilst in the Oval Office, he did not until it was brought up by the Democrats, and then the process of auditing his taxes commenced. Okay, so Nixon was not a guy naturally inclined to be transparent, but in the fall of 1976, he was in a world of hurt concerning his personal finances. In particular, critics were suggesting that there was something fishy about his tax returns. He eventually tried to clear things up by releasing his tax returns. He made the returns public in 1973 and asked the Congressional Joint Committee on Internal Revenue Taxation to examine them for errors. And they did find problems in the tax returns to the tune of $473,000, which is about 2.5 million in today's dollars, and it reflected real errors on Nixon's returns. Okay. So Nixon it was found that Nixon owed almost $500,000 in unpaid taxes and interest, and eventually Nixon promised to make good on the deficiency. Okay, so that sounds like that he was in office when he released those taxes, and he did so whilst under audit, which also makes makes a mockery or shows up Donald Trump's claim that he couldn't show his taxes because he was under audit. So now there's a dual layer of dishonesty. One, Nixon showed his taxes under audit. It's not an obstacle to showing your taxes. And two, Donald Trump was not being audited, and that's now being confirmed. And the head of the IRS, who's fortunately no longer in charge of the IRS, was derelict in his duty because it was mandatory for sitting presidents to have to be audited on their taxes each year. So interesting. I've left Donald Trump's face up for too long. Let's go away from there. I will see what I have saved into my bookmark section, because I always save interesting things. Oh, this is really moving. It's 24 seconds of the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, telling Biden something. Let's have a listen.
I want to give you something. One guy, he's really real hero, real captain, and he asked me to pass his award. And he asked me to pass his award to President Biden. That is the cross for military merit. That is one.
Oh, God love it.
Yes, that is from him. I want to give you something. One guy, he's really real hero, real captain, and he asked me to pass his award. And he asked me to pass his award to President Biden. That is the cross for military merit. That is one.
Oh, God love it.
Yes, that is.
So Biden said, God love him. That's apparently a captain from the Ukrainian army having asked Zelensky to give his Medal of the Cross to Biden. And I was trying to think what would be the motivation for that. And I'm imagining if you were hoping beyond hope that more of your fellow countrymen and women would be saved, that more Ukrainian children and more Ukrainian towns, communities, and cities would be saved from the predations of Russian attack and Russian expansionism, that giving your medal to Biden would reinforce to him that he was doing something necessary and something good in the face of domestic opposition, because there is always opposition. There are people saying, "Oh, I've seen memes representing Zelensky as a stripper trying to ask for money." There's very degrading things out there on the internet, obviously, and they're probably of Russian origin or conservative origin, because the Russian government and modern conservatives are often in a coalition of aligned values. That is to say, a misguided zealotry to protect their concept of civilization at the expense of everybody else. So they want to attack Ukraine, and they want to minimize the heroism of Volodymyr Zelensky and pretend that it's all corrupt and that Ukraine doesn't need these weapons, and that the money isn't even going to weaponry. They pretend that it's all just going to corrupt purposes to line the pockets of Zelensky and his inner circle, whereas Ukraine definitely has been spending the money on weapons and definitely been in receipt of weapons from America, because they've held off the Russian advances for so long. When Putin anticipated a swift victory over the nation of Ukraine in his efforts to expand Russian territory, feed his own ego at the expense of the national integrity, the sovereignty of Ukraine, and the blood of its people. I mean, if you've seen the pictures of the torture chamber that they've found in evacuated towns, in towns that they have taken over from Russian control, they've been able to placed once again under Ukrainian control, and they found torture chambers for children. So, it was a struggle and it was hard when Donald Trump's presidency led to there being detention centers for tender age children, that they were imprisoning babies and infants and toddlers away from their caregivers and parents. But tender age torture rooms are also quite hard to hear about. So I'm going to go back to that quote from John Lewis that I was referencing before. And that says, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." And then that's for white people also who are sometimes very late to the revelation that America has a lot of drowned pool politics happening. Drowned pool politics is a reference to swimming pools that were closed by white officials rather than integrate them. People who are so opposed to the idea of viewing other people with respect and sharing American resources respectfully with others, they would rather destroy those resources. They would rather sabotage the United States than share, and have to reconfigure their framing of the world that is organized hierarchically according to skin tone. And it's a very common human phenomenon to use a visual an attribute that can be readily identified visually, whether people are dark-skinned or not, and use that as a way to self-promote and say, I should have elevated status, I have entitlement, other people are lesser as a consequence of something I can see about them. I can see that they belong to a different tribe, and that makes me feel more solid in my own tribal membership and the superiority of that tribe. I know how negative attention can actually reinforce group solidarity, because after Kanye West was saying very negative things about Jewish people and celebrating the life and actions of a mass murderer who was a linchpin in orchestrating the mass murder of millions of Jewish people on the basis of their faith and their familial connection to Judaism, even if they were non-practicing Jews. You didn't have to be very much of a Jew to qualify to be deported and sent to a camp and murdered in Hitler's Europe, the parts of Europe that the Nazis were able to conquer. And I felt an enforcement of my own Jewishness and a strengthened yearning to do Jewish things. So yes, group solidarity can be enhanced when you perceive there to be a threat, an external threat. That's a psychological phenomenon, self-protective phenomenon, and some white people who can't understand history as a journey towards better, more enhanced cooperation and mutual understanding. Those people have to use dysfunctional methods to shore up their sense of self and to shore up their sense of group membership and group solidarity. They have to find people to hate and to feel superior to in order to function psychologically in the context of their own lives and their own disappointments. So I've had Zelensky on the screen for a while. I'll move away from that. I appreciate that scene, though. It's far more pleasant to see than Trump's face. Hey. All right. Now I'm going to leave soonish, but Stephanie Ruhle, who's a presenter for Which Channel? MSNBC, I think so, host of the 11th Hour on MSNBC weeknights, she points out an important pattern. So the Internal Revenue Service's inaction on Trump taxes show a pattern. Trump chooses a MAGA IRS guy and is able to avoid being audited for a few years until it's brought to the public's attention. The UPS guy that he appointed, Louis DeJoy, slowed the mail so that fewer votes made it on time. And knowing that those votes by mail would disproportionately be Biden voters with a rational fear of catching COVID prior to vaccinations, who would be more likely to avoid the crowds at a polling place and use that method to vote. Also in the context of Trump actively disparaging the method of voting by mail, and so deterring Republicans from availing themselves of that method. So he knew people who ignored Trump's negativity about mail-in voting, and people who ignored Trump's undermining of the truth about COVID, that it was a dangerous and contagious disease. People who ignored Trump would be less likely to vote for Trump. Anyway, it's how Trump tried to steal the 2020 election, or part of Trump's methodology for achieving that aim, and is often under-discussed, but I bring it up. And his acting Department of Defense guy, Christopher Miller, ignored the calls for Capitol Police to be sent to the Capitol. Actually, was it Capitol Police or National Guard? He ignored calls for all of it, and he'd already pre-written out a memo saying Capitol Police should not have weapons with them on that day, even though there were a lot of known threats. A lot of tips sent to the FBI from sources that they relied on, as well as concerned members of the public who knew they had relatives or people of their acquaintance who were speaking about their intention to come to the Capitol and commit violence in order to advance Trump's goal of overthrowing the government and overthrowing the results of the election. And also Trump appointed, number 4, an European Union ambassador to pressure Vladimir Zelensky for a confected story to disparage Joe Biden, his likely rival for 2020. So that's 4 appointments, all people willing to violate rules, disregard mandatory procedures, undermine institutions in order to advance Trump's agenda of despotic rule. And that USPS, United States Postal Service guy, Louis DeJoy, he can only be removed by the Postal Service Board, and as yet has not been removed. He's still there, despite his role in attempting to steal the election for Trump. So that's a thing. I might close with this. A couple of things. Okay, one, this very important comment that our support for Kiev, for Ukraine, is not charity. It supports our core national security interests and democratic principles. We aren't doing Ukraine favors. We have a partner willing to fight hard to defend our common interests and principles. Because yes, Vladimir Putin is the Adolf Hitler of our era. He does not stop at Ukraine if he succeeds in overthrowing the Ukrainian government and enslaving the Ukrainian people. No. Yes, he doesn't stop. If his aggression is rewarded, he turns his attentions to the next country and the next. So Hitler had fairly grandiose ambitions for the world, and it's irresponsible to project that Putin will have some nice, tidy little limits to his mad efforts to use violence, torture, mass rape, bombing of civilian infrastructure in conquest. He has a pattern of conquest and murder, and we all have a shared interest in enforcing limits on that murderous ambition. I just also want to note that Elon Musk, when he attended the World Cup, posed for a selfie with top Russian state propagandist Nelia Askazadeh in Qatar. She's a girlfriend of a sanctioned banker, Putin's private banker, Andrei Kostin. That not particularly attractive man featured there. So she's young and beautiful in a photo with Elon Musk, and there she is with her very wealthy banker boyfriend. Yes. An IRS memo apparently said there were too many problems to look into once they did commence the mandatory audit program. So when did they start doing this mandatory audit? An internal memo stated, with over 400 flow-through returns reported on the Form 1040, it is not possible to obtain the resources available to examine all potential issues. The designated agents found that the following issues, amongst others, warranted examination by the IRS. The charitable contributions, verification of net operating loss carryover schedule, related party loans, whether loans made to the former president's children are loans or disguised gifts that could trigger gift tax. Oh my goodness. All these things. So they don't have the resources. There were Trump's fire hose of BS approach, which is to just commit so many crimes and act with such audacity that people feel they can't investigate everything and to not even bother, to overwhelm the public and to overwhelm the IRS, the DOJ with too many crimes. Hopefully it's an approach that's run the end of its natural life. Hopefully it's an approach that no longer succeeds. I imagine Donald Trump following the news to see what he's being investigated for today and how the investigations are proceeding and who's been subpoenaed and who he has to try and bribe to keep quiet and who does he have to dangle employment opportunities to, because it's now known that Cassidy Hutchinson, her lawyer was being paid for by Trump's super PAC, her initial lawyer, and was advising her to lie to the January 6th committee. And she was being offered potential employment that could be very lucrative for her. And then the offers were no longer mentioned once it became known that she was going to be truthful to the committee. Anyway, it's very mob behavior, and all the data points that come out about Trump's misconduct, malfeasance, corruption, criminality, all of the weight of his misdoing, and to know that there are still so many people that support him and support the party that enabled him, it's heavy. It's heavy, which is why we need to keep supporting each other, cheering each other up, and remembering that, yes, this is part of the human condition. Some people behave badly and find that reinforcing. There's no karma that just responds in a timely fashion to stop bad people. We have to have the resolve and the skills to oppose them as strongly as we can. We have to strengthen our coalition. The acronym for that would be SOC, strengthen our coalition, because we have to acknowledge and match the degree of the sometimes chaotic and bumbling and incompetent actors who nevertheless have a very strong alignment of interests, and their interests are eroding democracy, eroding the ability of the people to balance out. You want me to go, darling? I will go. All right. Yes, I'm going to go get the children. Yes, rule of law is important. Thank you to those who listened today. Thank you, anyone who joined in, and to any replay viewers. I hope you enjoyed the show. Take care of yourselves and each other, and find ways to be strong like a reed, bending with the wind but not breaking. Thank you particularly to Christopher, and thanks for positively reinforcing my hat wearing. Take care. Bye.